They stood on the opposite side of the street, watching the light bloom in the window. One by one, the small square panes of glass, once dark and foreboding, ignited with a soft yellow warmth against the encroaching twilight. It was a sight Frank and Dorothy had seen 1,000 times, yet it never failed to settle a profound peace deep within their bones. The building before them was no longer a carcass of rust and brick, a monument to forgotten punishments. It was alive. It was a home. Inside its walls were the sounds of a meal being prepared, the murmur of quiet conversation, the cry of a baby, and the low hum of a heater that Frank had finally, painstakingly coaxed back to life. This place, the old Redemption County Jail, had been their ruin and their salvation. They had bought it for $6, a final, desperate act after their own children had taken everything and left them to fade away in a roadside motel. What they had built from its decay had shocked the county, the state, and most of all, themselves. It was a testament not to anger or revenge, but to the simple, stubborn power of a carpenter's hands and a bookkeeper's mind. But to understand the warmth of those lights, you have to understand the cold darkness that came before. I need to take you back to the beginning, to a different house and a different life. The old house had a scent all its own. It smelled of sawdust from Frank's workshop in the garage, the faint, sweet perfume of the rose bushes Dorothy tended by the porch, and the baked-in aroma of 50 years of shared meals. It was a small, sturdy bungalow on a quiet, tree-lined street. Frank had framed it himself, a younger man with a stronger back and the same quiet determination in his eyes. He had laid every floorboard, hung every door. His pride was not loud, but it was solid, tangible in the way the house had settled into itself without a single groan, weathering decades of storms and seasons. Dorothy had made it a home. She was a bookkeeper by trade, a woman who found comfort in the predictable order of ledgers and balanced accounts. That same precision she applied to their life. Meals were on time, bills were paid ahead of schedule, and the house was kept with a kind of gentle, unwavering discipline. They had raised 2 children there, Mark and Sarah. They had filled the small rooms with noise and life, with scraped knees and report cards, with teenage angst and graduation parties. Frank and Dorothy had given them everything they could, which was everything they had. They supported Mark through business school and helped with the down payment on his first condo. They co-signed the loan for Sarah's car when she started her new job as a paralegal. It was what parents did. You built a foundation, and you hoped your children would build upon it. The house was paid off. Their pensions were modest but adequate. Life in their 70s was supposed to be about reaping the small, quiet rewards of a life well lived, tending the garden, Frank's woodworking projects, and watching their grandchildren grow. The conversation started subtly. It began with Mark during one of his increasingly infrequent Sunday visits. He'd look around the living room with a thoughtful frown. "This is a big place for just the 2 of you," he'd say. Sarah would echo it on the phone. "Aren't you tired of the upkeep, Mom? The yard work, the cleaning? You and Dad deserve to relax." At first, Frank and Dorothy dismissed it. Relax? Frank's relaxation was in his workshop, the rasp of a hand plane over a piece of oak, his favorite song. Dorothy's relaxation was the satisfying weight of a ripe tomato from her garden in her palm. This house wasn't a burden. It was the repository of their entire life together. But the children were persistent. They began using words like investment and equity. They talked about the housing market, about how much the home they had built with their own hands was now worth. The number was abstract, meaningless to Frank and Dorothy. Its worth was in the pencil marks on the kitchen door frame, tracking their children's height. Its worth was in the worn spot on the armchair where Frank sat every evening. Their children, however, saw only a number, a large one. They framed it as a gift to their parents. You could be living in luxury, Sarah cooed. No chores, meals cooked for you, people your own age. They painted a picture of a place called Golden Valley Estates. It sounded idyllic. A brochure appeared on the coffee table featuring smiling, silver-haired seniors playing shuffleboard and taking watercolor classes. "We've already put a deposit down for you," Mark announced one evening, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It's a beautiful one-bedroom apartment. Everything is taken care of." Frank looked at Dorothy. He saw the doubt in her eyes, a mirror of his own. But how do you argue with your own children when they frame their actions in the language of love and concern? They were being told this was for their own good. To resist felt like being ungrateful, like being a burden. The thought was unbearable. So they agreed. They packed 50 years of life into cardboard boxes. Dorothy cried as she wrapped the porcelain teapot her mother had given her. Frank stood in his empty workshop, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. The children were briskly efficient. They hired movers. They arranged for a real estate agent. It all happened so fast, a whirlwind of signatures and schedules that left Frank and Dorothy feeling dizzy and disconnected. They trusted their children. They had to. Who else was there to trust? The day they left, Sarah hugged them tightly. "You're going to love it," she promised. Mark clapped his father on the shoulder. "It's the start of a new adventure, Dad." The drive was longer than they expected. They left their familiar town and drove for 2 hours, deep into a part of the state they didn't recognize. The landscape grew flatter, the town sparser. "Are we almost there?" Dorothy asked, looking out at the featureless stretch of highway. "Almost," Mark said from the driver's seat, his eyes fixed on the road. He didn't look at them in the rearview mirror. Finally, he pulled off the highway and into the parking lot of a 2-story building with a flickering neon sign. It read Starlight Inn. A long-haul truck was noisily idling in the lot. This was not the Golden Valley Estates from the brochure. "What is this?" Frank asked, his voice low. "Just a little stopover," Sarah said, her voice a little too bright. "The apartment isn't quite ready. A small delay with the painting. They said it will just be a few days, a week at most." Mark was already getting their suitcases out of the trunk. "We checked you in. Paid for the whole week. We've got to get back. Big meeting in the morning." He pushed a room key into Frank's hand. It was attached to a large plastic diamond. Room 207. Dorothy looked from the grim, peeling paint of the motel to the faces of her children. She was searching for the truth, for some sign that this was just a mistake. She found nothing. Their eyes were blank, evasive. They gave their parents quick, perfunctory hugs. "We'll call you tomorrow," Sarah said. "We'll be back to sort everything out as soon as the apartment is ready," Mark added. They got back in the car. Frank and Dorothy stood on the cracked pavement of the motel parking lot, their 2 suitcases beside them, and watched their children drive away. They watched until the taillights were just 2 small red dots in the distance. Then they were gone. They stood there for a long time, the sound of the idling truck filling the silence. Then Frank picked up the suitcases. "Let's go inside, Dot," he said. The words felt heavy and strange in his mouth. Room 207 smelled of stale smoke and disinfectant. The bedspread was a faded floral pattern, thin and rough to the touch. A single, small window looked out over the parking lot and the highway beyond. Dorothy sat on the edge of one of the beds, her purse clutched in her lap. She was perfectly still. Frank put the suitcases down. He walked to the window and pulled the grimy curtains shut. The action felt final. He didn't know what else to do. He sat on the other bed, facing his wife. The silence in the room was louder than the truck outside. For 50 years, They had faced everything together: sickness, financial worries, the trials of raising a family. But they had always been in their home, a fortress of their own making. Now they were displaced, adrift. They did not speak. There were no words for this feeling. It was a betrayal so profound it was beyond language. It was the quiet, terrifying realization that the foundation they had spent their entire lives building had just been dynamited by the very people it was built to support. The first night in the motel, neither of them slept. They just lay in the darkness, listening to the roar of the trucks on the highway, each one sounding like it was driving right through the center of their lives. The next day, they waited for the phone to ring. It sat on the small table between the beds, a silent, beige plastic box. Dorothy stared at it, willing it to life. Frank paced the small room, from the door to the window and back again, his footsteps a restless, caged rhythm on the thin carpet. The call never came. Not that day, not the next. On the third day, Dorothy used her cell phone to call Mark. It went straight to voicemail. "Mark, it's your mother. Please call us." Her voice was steady, betraying none of the cold dread coiling in her stomach. She called Sarah. Voicemail. "Sarah, honey, it's Mom. We're just wondering what the plan is. Call me back." They did not call back. By the fifth day, a terrible understanding began to dawn. It was a truth so monstrous they could barely look at it directly. This wasn't a stopover. This was the destination. There was no Golden Valley Estates. There was no apartment. There was only this room, this motel, this new, stark reality. Their children had taken their house, their money, and abandoned them. Frank tried calling again, his voice tight with a rage he hadn't felt in years. "Mark, this is your father. You call me back. You call me back right now." The words echoed in the small, empty room. The silence that followed was his only answer. The week they had been paid for came to an end. A crisp knock on the door from the motel manager reminded them. They paid for another week themselves, using the cash Dorothy had insisted they keep from the last bank withdrawal before the move. It felt like setting fire to a life raft. The money, a few $1,000s they'd kept for emergencies, was all they had left in the world. The proceeds from the house sale, the bulk of their life savings, were in an account controlled by Mark, an account they could not access. They were, for all intents and purposes, destitute. The Starlight Inn was too expensive. They knew they couldn't stay. Dorothy, the bookkeeper, began her research. She found a cheaper place, the Sleepy Hollow Motor Court, on the other side of town. The pictures online were grim. The reviews were worse. But it was half the price. The move was a quiet, humiliating affair. They called a taxi, their 2 suitcases their only worldly possessions. The Sleepy Hollow was even more dilapidated than they had feared. The room was smaller, damper. The lock on the door felt flimsy. Frank, the man who could build a house, jammed a chair under the doorknob each night. It was their only security. Here their invisibility felt complete. At the Starlight, they had been an anomaly. Here they fit right in. The other residents were transient, their faces etched with the same quiet desperation. No one made eye contact. They were all just trying to hold on for one more day. The shame was a physical weight. Dorothy, who had always held her head high, now walked with her eyes on the ground. Frank, whose hands were his pride, kept them shoved in his pockets, as if to hide their uselessness. He felt a phantom ache in his muscles, a yearning for the heft of a hammer, the grain of wood. Here, there was nothing to build, nothing to fix. There was only the slow, grinding erosion of decay. Dorothy insisted on one small act of defiance. Each morning, she would walk the 1.5 miles to the public library. It was a clean, quiet, orderly place. It reminded her of the world she used to belong to. She would sit at a public computer for hours, the hum of the machine a comforting sound. At first, she used it to search for her children. She found Mark's social media, pictures of him on a boat, smiling, a new watch on his wrist. She saw a post from Sarah announcing her promotion. They were living their lives, thriving. There was no mention of their parents. It was as if Frank and Dorothy had simply ceased to exist. The pain was sharp, a fresh stab with every cheerful photo. After a few days, she couldn't look anymore. Frank tried to find a way to fight back. He called the police department in their old hometown. He explained the situation, how their children had sold their house under false pretenses and taken the money. The officer on the other end of the line was polite but dismissive. "Sir, it sounds like a family dispute," he said, his voice weary. "You signed the papers, correct? From what you're telling me, your son has power of attorney. If you believe there was fraud, you'll need to hire a lawyer. It's a civil matter." A civil matter. The words were a brick wall. A lawyer cost money, money they did not have. The system, the one they had paid into and trusted their entire lives, had no place for them. They had fallen through the cracks, and no one was willing to extend a hand to pull them out. They were truly, utterly alone. The low point was not a single moment, but a long gray expanse of days. It was the taste of cheap coffee, the feeling of the lumpy motel mattress, the sight of their dwindling cash in the envelope Dorothy kept. It was the crushing silence where a family used to be. It was the terrifying realization that the world saw them as nothing more than a problem to be ignored. It was on one of those long, gray afternoons in the library that Dorothy's aimless searching took an unexpected turn. She had given up looking for her children, for legal aid, for a way back to her old life. That door was closed. Now she just clicked, letting the internet carry her where it would, a digital drifter. She found herself on a government website, a dusty corner of the county's official portal. A list of surplus properties for auction. It was a sad collection of forgotten things. Empty lots choked with weeds. A derelict fleet of rusted maintenance trucks. Buildings condemned and slated for demolition. She scrolled through the listings, not with any purpose, but with a kind of morbid curiosity. These were the things the world had discarded, just like them. Then she saw it. The photo was small and grainy, taken on an overcast day. It showed a 2-story brick building, squat and grim. Its windows were narrow slits, covered with thick iron bars. Rust bled in long orange streaks down the brick from the window frames and the roofline. Ivy clung to one wall like a shroud. The description was brief. Former Redemption County Jail and Holding Facility. Closed 1978. Property sold as is. Structure is derelict. She clicked for more details. The property had been sold a year ago to a shell corporation for a pittance. The corporation had intended to tear it down for scrap metal, but they had defaulted on the taxes, and the property had reverted to the county. The county didn't want the liability. They just wanted it gone. The listing was for the defaulted bid. The price was $6. $6? The number was absurd. It was a joke. But Dorothy didn't laugh. She stared at the picture. She saw what anyone would see: decay, ruin, a place of misery. But beneath the rust and the grime, she saw something else. She saw a foundation. She saw walls of solid brick and reinforced concrete. She saw a steel frame. She saw a structure that had been built to withstand anything, to last forever. Frank's words from long ago echoed in her mind. From when he was building their house, the most important thing is the bones. If the bones are good, you can fix anything. The jail had good bones. It was a fortress, a place with walls, a place you couldn't easily be thrown out of. An idea, cold and sharp and utterly insane, began to form in the back of her mind. It was a tiny spark in the vast darkness of their despair. She printed the single page with the grainy photo and the description. She folded it carefully and put it in her purse. All the way back to the motel, her heart beat a little faster. It was a foolish idea, a desperate fantasy. But it was also the first new idea she'd had in months. It was the first thought that wasn't about what she had lost, but about what might be possible. When she got back to the room, Frank was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank television screen. He looked smaller than he used to, diminished by the idleness and the shame. "Frank," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He looked up. She unfolded the paper and held it out to him. Frank took the paper from her hand. He stared at the grainy photograph of the derelict jail. His first reaction was a tired confusion. "What is this, Dot?" he asked. His voice was flat, worn down by weeks of hopelessness. He saw the rust, the barred windows, the look of a place that had been left to die. It looked like how he felt. "It's for sale," Dorothy said. She watched his face, trying to gauge his reaction. "The county is selling it for $6. Frank let out a short, harsh sound that wasn't quite a laugh. It was a sound of disbelief, of bitter irony. $6, he repeated. "We can't even afford a real meal, and you're looking at buying a jail." He handed the paper back to her, a gesture of dismissal. "It's junk. It's less than junk." But Dorothy didn't take it. She pushed it back toward him. "Look at it, Frank. Really look." He sighed, but he took the paper again. He was a carpenter. He had spent his life looking at structures, understanding them from the inside out. He squinted at the photo, his eyes tracing the lines of the building. He saw the plumb of the wall. He saw the heavy stone lintels above the windows. He saw that despite the surface decay, the building itself was not sagging. It was not collapsing. It was, against all odds, standing firm. "It's still standing," Dorothy said, her voice barely a whisper, as if she were reading his mind. That simple phrase hung in the air between them. They had been knocked down. Their lives had been demolished. But this place, this forgotten ruin, was still standing. "It's made of brick and steel," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "They built it to last. The bones are good, Frank. You always said that's what matters." He looked from the picture to his wife. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes he hadn't seen since they'd left their home. Not hope, exactly. It was something harder than that. It was resolve. It was the look she got when she was wrestling with a particularly difficult ledger, a look of focused, unyielding determination. She had done the math. Not just the financial math, but the math of their survival. They had a little over $2,000 left. Their options were dwindling to nothing. They could stay in this motel until the money ran out, and then, what? A shelter? The street? This jail, as insane as it seemed, was an option. It was a tangible thing. "What would we do with it?" he asked, the question itself a small concession, a crack in the wall of his despair. "We would have a roof," she said simply, "a roof that no one could take from us. We would have walls. We would own it. It would be ours." The word own was powerful. They had owned their home for 48 years, and they had learned how little that could mean. But this would be different. This would be a $6 fortress. "It's in a town called Redemption," Dorothy added. The name felt like a sign, a piece of cosmic poetry she was afraid to say out loud. Frank was silent for a long time. He looked at his hands. They were soft now, the calluses fading. They were the hands of an old man in a motel room. He hated them. He flexed his fingers, imagining the feel of a hammer, the satisfying resistance of a nail driving into wood. The jail was a problem, a massive, overwhelming, probably impossible problem. But it was a problem he could touch, a problem he could work on. It was a fight he could understand, unlike the shadow boxing with voicemails and indifferent bureaucrats. He looked at Dorothy, at her straight back, and the fierce light in her eyes. For weeks they had been victims. In that moment she was refusing to be a victim any longer, and he knew he could not let her do it alone. He took a deep breath, the stale motel air filling his lungs. "All right, Dot," he said, his voice raspy. "Let's go look at our castle." The ghost of a smile touched Dorothy's lips. It was the first time either of them had smiled in a month. The journey to redemption was an act of faith. They used 100 of their precious dollars on 2 one-way bus tickets. The bus rumbled through the flat, forgotten parts of the state, a landscape of tired farms and small towns that seemed to be slowly sinking back into the earth. Redemption, when they finally arrived, was little more than a crossroads. A gas station, a small grocery, a church with a peeling steeple, and a row of boarded-up storefronts. The bus hissed to a stop and left them on a dusty curb, their 2 suitcases the only evidence they had come from somewhere else. The town was quiet, wrapped in a blanket of sleepy indifference. They asked for directions at the gas station. The attendant, a teenager with bored eyes, pointed down the main street. "End of the road, can't miss it, the old jail." They walked, their suitcases rolling behind them on the cracked sidewalk. The jail sat on a corner lot, set back from the road, looking even more formidable and decayed than it had in the photograph. It was a brutalist brick box, a testament to a time when justice was about containment and nothing more. The rust streaks were like dried blood. The ivy had grown thick and wild, prying at the mortar between the bricks. A heavy chain, secured with a fat, rusted padlock, was wrapped around the 2 handles of the main door. It looked less like a building and more like a tomb. Frank walked the perimeter, his hand trailing along the rough brick. He peered through the bars of a ground-floor window into the blackness within. He kicked at the foundation. It was solid. Dorothy stood on the sidewalk, her purse clutched in her hands, watching him. This was his world, the world of stress and structure, of load-bearing walls and decay. She waited for his verdict. He completed his circuit and came back to her. He was covered in dust and cobwebs, but his eyes were different. They were alive, engaged. "The roof is shot," he said. "Probably leaks like a sieve. The pointing is gone in half the brickwork. God knows what the plumbing looks like." He paused, and for a second, Dorothy's heart sank. Then he added, "But the walls are straight, and the foundation is solid rock." He looked at her. "The bones are good." Their next stop was the county clerk's office, a small, stuffy room in the back of the town hall. The clerk was a woman with a mountain of white hair and glasses perched on the end of her nose. When Dorothy explained they were there to purchase the old jail property, the woman blinked at them. "The jail?" she asked, as if she had misheard. "Yes," Dorothy said, placing the printed listing on the counter. The clerk looked at the paper, then back at them. A slow smile spread across her face, a mix of amusement and pity. "Well, I'll be," she murmured. "Figured that thing would just fall down on its own eventually." She shuffled through a stack of files, blew dust off a large ledger, and ran her finger down a page. "Yep, here it is. Property 734, $6. She said the price as if it were the punchline to a long-running joke. Dorothy carefully counted out 6 $1 bills from her envelope and placed them on the counter. The clerk took the money with a theatrical flourish. She stamped a thick document with a heavy, satisfying thud, signed it, and pushed it across the counter. "It's all yours," she said, her smile widening. "Good luck." With the deed in hand, they made one last stop. A small, cluttered hardware store with the words Hobbs Hardware painted in faded letters on the window. Inside, they bought a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters, a lantern, and 2 pairs of work gloves. The purchase took another significant bite out of their dwindling funds. They walked back to the jail as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the street. They stood before the chain door. This was it, the point of no return. Frank took the bolt cutters. The tool felt good in his hands, solid and purposeful. He positioned the jaws around the thick, rusted chain link. He squeezed. His muscles, soft from weeks of inactivity, strained with the effort. The metal groaned in protest. He squeezed harder, putting all his weight, all his frustration, all his quiet rage into the handles. With a loud, sharp crack that echoed in the quiet street, the chain snapped. The 2 ends fell away, clattering onto the stone steps. The sound was deafening. It was the sound of a lock being broken. It was the sound of freedom. Frank unwound the useless chain and dropped it to the ground. He looked at Dorothy and handed her the old, rusted key they had been given by the clerk. "You do it," he said. Her hand trembled as she slid the key into the massive lock. It resisted, stiff from decades of disuse. She turned it with both hands. There was a grinding shriek of metal on metal, and then a heavy, resonant clunk. The lock was open. Together they put their shoulders to the heavy steel door and pushed. It groaned, it scraped, but it moved. It swung inward into a wall of darkness, and the thick, cold smell of damp earth, rust, and forgotten time. They had arrived. Frank lit the lantern. The circle of yellow light pushed back the oppressive darkness, revealing the entrance hall. Dust lay thick as a blanket on every surface. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling like ghostly chandeliers. A large, formidable desk sat in the center of the room, its surface warped and peeling. To their left, a corridor stretched into blackness, lined with solid steel doors. The cell block. Frank took a step inside, his boots crunching on debris. Dorothy followed, pulling the heavy door closed behind them. The sound of it shutting echoed with the deep finality, sealing them inside. For a moment, a wave of panic washed over her. The barred windows, the steel doors, the suffocating silence. This was a prison. What had they done? But then she looked at Frank. He was holding the lantern high, his face illuminated from below. He was not looking at the decay. He was looking at the structure. He was already working, his mind dismantling the ruin and seeing the possibilities beneath. "We start with 1 room," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "1 room we can live in, clean it out, seal it from the weather." He walked down the corridor, peering into the small barred windows on each cell door. Most were empty, just barren concrete boxes. He stopped at the first cell on the right. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open. It was a small 9-by-6-foot space. A steel slab for a bed was bolted to the wall, a rusted toilet and sink in the corner. High on the back wall was a single, narrow window, its bars thick with rust. Unlike the others, this cell was not empty. A thick layer of dried leaves and dirt covered the floor, blown in through the broken window pane. "This one," Frank said, "the window faces south. It'll get the most light." That first night, they didn't sleep in the cell. They laid their bedrolls on the dusty floor of the main hall, the lantern casting dancing shadows on the high ceiling. It was cold, a deep, penetrating cold that settled into their bones. The silence was absolute, broken only by the scuttling of unseen things and the mournful sigh of the wind through the broken panes of glass. But it was a different kind of cold than the artificial chill of the motel room. This was the cold of a challenge, not of defeat. This was a cold they could fight. The next morning the work began. Frank, with a borrowed broom from the gas station, started sweeping out the first cell. It was a simple, mundane task, But it was an act of reclamation. With every push of the broom, he was clearing away not just leaves and dust, but decades of neglect and misery. He was claiming the space. Dorothy, meanwhile, took out a small notebook and a pen. She started a new ledger. At the top of the page, she wrote, "The Redemption Project." She drew a line down the middle. On one side, expenses. On the other, asset. The expense column was terrifyingly long. The asset column had only one entry, property $6. She began to make lists. Lists of what needed to be cleaned, lists of what needed to be repaired, lists of what they would need to buy, the roof, the windows, the plumbing, the electricity. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming, a mountain of impossibility. But breaking it down into small, manageable lines on a page made it feel, if not possible, then at least approachable. It was how she had always managed their life, through order and careful planning. This was no different, just on a terrifyingly larger scale. By the end of the first day, they had one clean cell. Frank had used scrap wood he'd found in the yard to board up the broken window, sealing it against the wind. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. They moved their bedrolls into the tiny concrete room. It was cramped and stark, but it was theirs. It was the first space they had owned since their children had taken their home. That night, as they lay in the dark, Dorothy reached out and took Frank's hand. His skin was rough, coated with a fine layer of dust. For the first time in months, his hand felt like his own again. It felt like the hand of a builder. The next few days fell into a rhythm. Frank worked. He was a force of nature, a man rediscovering his purpose. He tore out the rusted, non-functional toilet and sink from their cell. He scraped rust from the steel bed frame. He found a section of the roof directly above their cell that was relatively intact and focused his efforts there, patching the few small holes with tar he'd bought at the hardware store. Every task was a battle. Every screw was rusted. Every pipe was seized. But with each small victory, a loosened bolt, a sealed crack, a piece of the old Frank returned. The stoop in his shoulders lessened. The light came back into his eyes. He was no longer a victim waiting for the end. He was a man with a job to do. Dorothy's job was just as critical. She was the strategist, the quartermaster. She managed their dwindling cash with ruthless efficiency. She learned where to find the cheapest bread, how to make a can of soup last for 2 meals. But she knew it wasn't enough. Frank needed tools. He needed materials. Wood, pipes, wire, cement, things that cost money they did not have. This led them back to the one place in town that had shown them a sliver of possibility, Hobbs Hardware. They walked into the store, the bell above the door announcing their arrival. Earl Hobbs was behind the counter, organizing a display of drill bits. He was a man of their generation, with kind eyes and hands that showed a lifetime of work. He looked up and gave them a nod. "The jailbirds return," he said, a small, wry smile on his face. It wasn't mean-spirited. It was a greeting between peers. Frank, his pride a stubborn, thorny thing, got straight to the point. He had a list, written on a scrap of cardboard. "I need a few things," he said, pushing the list across the counter. "A good handsaw, a pry bar, some roofing tar, a bag of cement mix." He paused. "I don't have the cash for it all today, but I'm a carpenter. I'm good for it." It cost him everything to say those words, to admit his need. Earl picked up the list. He read it slowly. He looked at Frank's hands, then at Dorothy's determined face. He had seen them in town. He'd heard the story from the clerk. He knew who they were, and he could guess at what had happened to them. He saw not beggars, but proud people pushed to the edge. He saw a fellow craftsman in Frank, a man who spoke the language of tools and materials. Earl set the list down. He didn't look at the cash register. Instead, he walked out from behind the counter and led Frank down an aisle stacked high with lumber. "What kind of saw are you looking for?" he asked. "Something with a fine tooth for finish work, or a cross-cut for framing?" The question was a test, a shibboleth. Frank's face lit up. "A cross-cut for now," he said. "I've got some framing to do on the roof joists. The water damage is pretty extensive in the north wing." For the next 10 minutes, they didn't talk about money. They talked about wood. They talked about tools. They talked about the challenges of working with old brick and damp concrete. It was a conversation between two men who understood the physical world, who knew the satisfaction of making something right. Finally, Earl led them back to the counter. He had gathered everything on Frank's list, and a few things that weren't: a better hammer, a box of galvanized nails, a sturdy level. "Take it," Earl said, gesturing to the pile of supplies. Dorothy opened her mouth to speak, to explain their situation, but Earl held up a hand. "I'll open an account for you," he said, his voice matter of fact. "You're working on the old jail. That's a big project. You'll be a regular customer." He looked Frank in the eye. "Pay me when you can, a little at a time. I know a good worker when I see one. I know you're good for it." Dorothy was stunned into silence. It was an act of profound, unadorned kindness. It wasn't charity. He had made it clear this was a business transaction, a professional courtesy, but it felt like a lifeline. In a world that had dismissed them as worthless, this man, this stranger, had looked at them and seen value. He saw their integrity. He was investing in their character. Frank, a man of few words, simply nodded. The nod was heavy with gratitude, with a promise to repay not just the money, but the trust. They left the store with a wheelbarrow full of supplies, their first real arsenal in the war against decay. The weight of the cement bag, the solid feel of the new hammer, it was the weight of hope. Earl Hobbs had given them more than just tools and materials. He had given them the first block to rebuild their faith in other people. He was their first ally. The supplies from Earl changed everything. They moved from mere survival to actual construction. Frank's days became a blur of focused, strenuous labor. He attacked the roof first, the source of the worst decay. He tore away the rotten shingles and crumbling tar paper above their small section of the jail, exposing the skeletal joists beneath. Many were soft with rot. With the new saw and fresh lumber from Earl's, he began the painstaking process of cutting out the diseased wood and splicing in new, solid beams. It was slow, dangerous work. He worked alone on the pitched roof, a 70-year-old man held in place by sheer willpower. Dorothy would watch from the yard below, her heart in her throat, as he balanced precariously, his hammer rising and falling in a steady, reassuring rhythm. Dorothy's domain was the ground floor. She was the commander of logistics, the architect of their new life. With the first bag of cement, she learned to mix mortar. She had watched Frank do it 100 times over the years. Her first few batches were lumpy, unworkable, but she was a bookkeeper. She understood ratios, precision, and patience. She kept trying, adjusting the mix of sand, cement, and water until it was just right. She began the long, tedious task of repointing the brickwork around their cell, scraping out the crumbling old mortar and filling the gaps with fresh, strong cement. Her hands, once accustomed to the smooth glide of a pen, became raw and chapped. She wore the scrapes and cuts as badges of honor. News of their project began to ripple through the quiet town of Redemption. People were curious. The sight of smoke curling from a makeshift chimney Frank had rigged up from the jail was a source of constant gossip at the town's small diner. The steady, daily rhythm of Frank's hammering became a new part of the town's soundscape. At first, people just drove by slowly, staring. Then they started stopping. An old farmer named George, who had known Earl Hobbs for 60 years, was the first. He pulled his dusty pickup truck over and watched Frank on the roof for a solid 10 minutes. Then he got out and walked over to Dorothy, who was mixing mortar near the front steps. "That's a fool's job or a brave one," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Not sure which yet." Dorothy just nodded, not breaking the rhythm of her trowel. George watched her for another minute. "My barn's got a pile of old tin roofing behind it," he said. "Been meaning to haul it to the dump. It's got some rust, but no holes. Might be better than what you got up there." He tipped his hat and drove off. The next morning, a pile of corrugated tin sheets was neatly stacked by their front door. He was not the last. A retired electrician named Sal heard about the project from Earl. He showed up one afternoon with a toolbox and a roll of wire. "Heard you folks are living in the dark ages," he said gruffly. "Let's see if we can't get a light on for you." He spent the rest of the day tracing the jail's ancient, dead wiring, shaking his head and muttering to himself. By nightfall, he had managed to bypass the main breaker and run a single, safe line into Frank and Dorothy's cell. He screwed a bare bulb into a simple porcelain fixture he'd attached to the ceiling. When he flipped the switch, the small cell was flooded with bright, clean electric light. It was dazzling. Dorothy gasped. It was the first time they hadn't had to rely on the flickering, uncertain light of the lantern. It felt like a miracle. Sal refused any payment. "Call it a professional challenge," he grunted. "Haven't seen a mess like that since the Army." Momentum began to build. The small acts of kindness started to link together, forming a chain of support. The pile of tin from the farmer allowed Frank to cover a much larger section of the roof, protecting the main hall from the autumn rains. Sal's single working light was a proof of concept, showing that the building's electrical system, while archaic, was not entirely hopeless. The project began to feel less like a desperate gamble and more like a real, viable endeavor. They were no longer just two abandoned old people in a ruin. They were becoming a local phenomenon. They were the people who were fixing the jail. It was a cold evening in late October when the first one arrived. A storm was rolling in, the wind howling around the corners of the jail with a mournful sound. Frank and Dorothy were in their cell, which was now dry, well-lit, and almost cozy. Frank was sharpening a chisel, and Dorothy was poring over her ledger, the account at Hobbs Hardware, a growing but manageable debt. They heard a hesitant knock on the huge front door. They looked at each other, surprised. No one ever came at night. Frank took the lantern and went to open it. A young woman stood on the steps, shivering in the wind. She couldn't have been more than 20. She wore a thin hoodie and clutched a threadbare backpack to her chest. She was visibly pregnant, and one side of her face was darkened with a fresh, ugly bruise. I heard," she stammered, her teeth chattering. "I heard you folks had a place. I don't have anywhere to go." She looked past Frank into the dim light of the entrance hall. She wasn't looking for a handout. She was looking for sanctuary. Dorothy had followed Frank to the door. She saw the fear in the young woman's eyes, the same desperate, cornered look she recognized from her own reflection in the motel mirror weeks ago. She saw the bruise, and her heart clenched with a cold, protective anger. She didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, past Frank, and put a gentle hand on the young woman's arm. "Come in out of the cold," she said. Her voice was soft, but it held the authority of a command. The young woman's name was Lily. Her story came out in quiet, halting pieces as she sipped a cup of hot tea Dorothy had made for her on their small camp stove. The baby's father had a temper. It had gotten worse lately. Tonight he had thrown her out. She had nowhere to go, no family to call. Someone at the gas station had told her about the old couple at the jail. "They're fixing it up," the person had said. "Maybe they have a room." Frank had been working on the cell next to theirs. It was clean, and he had just finished patching the roof above it. It had no light, no furniture except for a steel slab bolted to the wall. But it was dry, and it was secure. Frank found a spare bedroll and a blanket. Dorothy walked Lily to the cell door. "It's not much," Dorothy said apologetically. Lily looked into the small bare room. She touched the solid steel door. She looked at the thick walls. "It's safe," she whispered, a world of relief in those two words. Lily's arrival marked a fundamental shift. The project was no longer just about their own survival. It was about something more. Lily was not a burden. She became a part of the small, functioning ecosystem. She was young and strong despite her pregnancy. She insisted on helping. She took over the cleaning, sweeping the long corridors with a vigor that put them to shame. She helped Dorothy organize the growing pile of donated supplies. Her presence brought a new energy to the cold stone building. The next week, another person appeared, a 17-year-old boy named Alex, his face a mask of defiant misery. His parents had kicked him out when they found out he was gay. He had been sleeping in his car until he ran out of gas. He had heard the story about the jail from the pastor at the church who had taken an interest in Frank and Dorothy's project. Alex was sullen and withdrawn at first, but he was good with technology. He saw Dorothy's handwritten ledger and, using the library's computer, created a detailed spreadsheet for her. He cataloged every nail, every board, every dollar spent and owed. He found a way to get the jail's ancient water pump working, providing a trickle of non-potable water they could use for cleaning and mixing cement. He was followed by an elderly man named Arthur, who had lost his small farm to the bank. Arthur was quiet and weathered, but he knew the earth. He looked at the barren, gravel-covered prison yard and saw potential. He started a compost pile in a corner. He began clearing the gravel, one wheelbarrow at a time, exposing the hard-packed soil beneath. "Give it time," he told Dorothy, his hands full of dark, rich compost. "You can grow anything, anywhere, if you're patient enough." Slowly, imperceptibly, a community was forming within the jail's walls. It was a collection of the discarded, the broken, the lost. Each person had arrived with nothing but their own story of pain and abandonment. But here, inside the cold brick walls, they found a purpose. Frank was the builder, the patriarch, his steady work, the heartbeat of the place. Dorothy was the planner, the matriarch, her quiet competence the brain. Lily was the heart, her youthful energy and impending motherhood a symbol of new life. Alex was the innovator, bringing a modern mind to their analog world. Arthur was the nurturer, promising a future harvest from barren ground. Each person contributed what they could. They shared the work. They shared the meager meals. They were a strange, unlikely family, forged in a crucible of shared hardship. The jail, a place designed for isolation and punishment, was becoming the opposite. It was a place of connection and redemption, not just in name, but in practice. Each newly cleaned cell that housed a new person was a victory. Each shared meal in the cold entrance hall was an act of defiance. They were building more than just a shelter. They were building a refuge. If you've made it this far in the story, you're seeing the turning point. You're seeing how two people, left with nothing, began to build something incredible, not just for themselves, but for others. It's a testament to resilience. What would you do in this position? Would you have had the courage to buy that jail? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're finding value in this story, please hit that subscribe button. It helps more than you know. Now, back to Redemption, where their new world was about to face its greatest threat. The town of Redemption was small, and small towns have their own peculiar currents of opinion. For every person like Earl Hobbs or Farmer George who saw what Frank and Dorothy were doing as something noble, there was someone who saw it as a problem. A man named Walter Pims, who owned the largest and only well-maintained house in town, was chief among them. He saw the jail not as a story of resilience, but as an eyesore that was getting worse. He saw the growing number of residents not as people being helped, but as vagrants and squatters. He saw the smoke from their chimney, the pile of old tin, the constant hammering, and it offended his sense of order. He started making phone calls. He called the town council. He called the county zoning board. He called the health department. He complained about property values, about unlicensed construction, about potential health hazards. He was a squeaky wheel, and he squeaked until he got results. The threat arrived on a Tuesday morning. It came in the form of a county official car, a clean white sedan that looked alien parked in front of the rustic jail. A man in a crisp shirt and tie got out, a clipboard in his hand. His name was Henderson, and he was a code enforcement inspector. He had a sour, impatient look on his face, the look of a man who dealt with problems all day and had no doubt that this was just another one. He didn't knock. He strode to the front door and began plastering it with official-looking notices. Frank saw him from the roof and began to climb down. Dorothy met him at the door. Henderson didn't greet them. He just pointed a finger at the most prominent notice, its bold, red letters screaming a single word: condemnation. "This structure is unsafe and uninhabitable," Henderson said, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "It fails to meet county code on multiple significant violations." He started listing them off, a litany of doom: inadequate electrical wiring, non-compliant plumbing, structural instability in the roof, lack of proper fire escape, unsanitary living conditions. He gestured vaguely at Lily, who was sweeping the hall. "And you're running an unlicensed boarding house." He tapped the condemnation notice with his pen. "You have 30 days, he announced. 30 days to bring this entire structure up to full residential code. If you fail to do so, the county will seize the property and demolish it. The clock starts now." He didn't wait for a response. He got back in his car and drove away, leaving them standing in the doorway, the white and red notices fluttering in the breeze like flags of surrender. The news fell like a hammer blow on the small community. 30 days. It was an impossible timeline. What they had accomplished in months of back-breaking labor was just a tiny fraction of what would be needed to satisfy a county inspector. The electrical system needed to be completely rewired. The entire plumbing system needed to be replaced. Every window, every door, the entire roof, it all had to be brought up to modern standards. It would take a team of professional contractors months, and it would cost a fortune they didn't have. Despair, thick and suffocating, settled over the jail once more. It felt like the universe was playing a cruel joke. They had fought so hard, had come so far, only to be crushed by the impersonal, implacable fist of bureaucracy. That night, the jail was silent. The sound of Frank's hammer was gone. No one had the heart to eat. They were defeated. The next morning, it was Lily who broke the silence. She found Dorothy sitting at the old warden's desk, staring at the condemnation notice. The ledger was closed. "We can't just give up," Lily said, her voice fierce. She placed a protective hand on her swollen belly. "This is my home. This is my baby's first home. We have to fight." Her words, full of a young person's righteous fire, were a spark. Dorothy looked at the girl she had taken in from the cold. She looked at her fierce, determined face. Lily was right. They had been given a death sentence, but they weren't dead yet. They had 30 days. They had to try. The first person they went to was Earl Hobbs. They laid the notice on his counter. He read it slowly, his brow furrowed. He let out a long, low whistle. "Walter Pims," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. "He's been complaining for weeks." He looked at Frank and Dorothy, at their tired but resolute faces. "This is bad," he said. "Henderson is a by-the-book man. He's not going to cut you any slack." He tapped the list of violations. "But it's just a list. It's a job list." He looked at Frank. "We've got 30 days. Let's get to work." Earl made the first call. He called Sal, the retired electrician. Sal came down to the store, looked at the notice, and let out a string of curses. "That son of a... an entire rewire? In 30 days?" He shook his head. "It's impossible." He looked at Frank, at Lily, who had come with them, at Earl. He sighed. "It's impossible, but I guess we can start with the main panel." Word spread like wildfire through the small town. The condemnation notice, meant to be an ending, became a rallying cry. This was no longer about a strange old couple and their weird project. It had become a battle for the soul of the town. It was Walter Pims and his sterile sense of order against the messy, compassionate chaos of the Hope House, as the locals had started calling it. The next day, Sal didn't show up alone. He brought 2 other retired union electricians with him. The farmer George showed up with his 2 grown sons and a truck full of tools. The pastor from the church announced a special collection on Sunday, not for the church, but for the jailhouse fund. He also put a notice in the church bulletin, "Many hands make light work. The Hope House needs yours." The response was overwhelming. People started showing up, not just the retired tradesmen, but teachers, store clerks, farmers, teenagers. Some came with tools, ready to work. Some came with bags of groceries or boxes of donated paint and drywall. Women from the church organized a meal train, ensuring the growing crew of volunteers had hot food every day. The jail, once a place of quiet, desperate work, was transformed into a bustling, chaotic, hopeful construction site. It was a barn raising, but for a prison. Frank, who had been working alone for so long, suddenly found himself the foreman of a large, motley crew. He directed the electricians, the plumbers, the drywallers, his voice steady and confident. He was in his element, a general commanding his troops. Dorothy, with Alex's help, managed the logistics, directing the flow of materials and people with the precision of a field marshal. The 30-day deadline loomed over them, a ticking clock, but for the first time they felt they had a fighting chance. The community they had built, person by person, was now rallying to save them. It was in the middle of this frantic, hopeful chaos that the past returned. A sleek, expensive sedan, a late-model BMW, pulled up in front of the jail. It was so clean and new, it looked like it had landed from another planet. The driver's door opened, and a man in a tailored suit stepped out. It was Mark. He had heard about his parents' project from a distant relative who had seen the story in a small-town newspaper's online edition. The headline was something like, "Local Couple Turns Jail into Homeless Shelter." The article was accompanied by a picture of Frank and Dorothy, standing proudly in front of their half-finished work. For Mark, the story was not a source of pride. It was a source of deep, burning shame. He strode towards the entrance, his expensive shoes scuffing on the gravel. He had an expression of profound disgust on his face. He saw the crowd of volunteers, the piles of lumber, the general mess of construction, and he winced. This was not the quiet, invisible, fading away he had planned for his parents. This was a spectacle. He found Dorothy in the main hall, directing two teenagers who were painting a wall. "Mother," he said, his voice sharp. Dorothy turned. For a moment she didn't recognize him. He looked like a stranger, a well-dressed man from another world. Then she saw his eyes, the same evasive eyes from the motel parking lot. She felt nothing. The searing pain of the betrayal had cooled over the months into a hard, cold emptiness. There was simply a vast distance between them. "What is all this?" Mark demanded, gesturing around the chaotic hall. "What in God's name are you doing? Living in a jail? Taking in strays? The whole family is talking about it. It's embarrassing. Embarrassing." The word hung in the air. Dorothy looked at him, at his expensive suit, his polished shoes, his face flushed with indignation. He was embarrassed. He had left his parents to rot in a motel, had stolen their life savings, and he was the one who was embarrassed. A quiet, calm clarity settled over her. "We are building a home," she said. Her voice was level, factual. There was no anger in it, no accusation. It was a simple statement of truth. It was this lack of emotion that seemed to enrage Mark more than anything. "A home? This is a filthy ruin," he spat. "You should be in Golden Valley. You should be comfortable. We arranged everything for you." "There is no Golden Valley, Mark," Dorothy said, her voice still unnervingly calm. Frank had come down from the second floor, drawn by the sound of his son's voice. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, his work clothes covered in dust, a hammer in his hand. He didn't say a word. He just watched. "You were supposed to be taken care of," Mark insisted, his voice rising. "This is not what we wanted." "What did you want, Mark?" Dorothy asked, her eyes boring into him. "Did you want us to just disappear, to die quietly in that motel room so you could have the house money without any guilt?" The directness of the question struck him silent for a moment. He sputtered, trying to regain his footing. "It wasn't like that. The house was too much for you. We were trying to help." "You helped yourself," Frank said, his first words. His voice was a low growl. He took a step forward. He was no longer the diminished old man from the motel. He was the man who had tamed this building, who commanded a crew of volunteers. He was strong again. Mark looked from his mother's cold, clear eyes to his father's quiet, powerful anger, and he saw that he had no power here. He was an outsider. He had come here expecting to find two pathetic old people he could scold and bully back into invisibility. Instead, he found two people who were stronger and more alive than he had ever seen them. They had a purpose, they had a community, they had a home, and he had nothing to do with it. "This is insane," he muttered, shaking his head. He turned and walked away. He didn't look back. He got in his shiny car and drove off, leaving a cloud of dust behind him. No one watched him go. They all had work to do. The confrontation with Mark, instead of demoralizing them, had the opposite effect. It was a final severing of a tie that had long been poisoning them. It clarified their purpose. They were not just fighting the county. They were fighting the world that Mark represented, a world of selfish convenience and disposable people. The last 2 weeks before the deadline were a blur of frantic activity. The jail hummed with energy from dawn until long after dusk. Sal and his team worked miracles with the wiring, pulling new Romex through ancient conduits, installing new breaker panels, and ensuring every single outlet and fixture was up to code. A young plumber who had just started his own business and was moved by their story took on the plumbing, replacing a century of rusted iron pipe with clean, new PVC and copper. Volunteers swarmed over the building, painting, sanding, and cleaning. The women from the church set up a makeshift kitchen in what used to be the warden's office, keeping a steady supply of coffee, sandwiches, and hot soup flowing to the workers. Arthur, the old farmer, had managed to turn a patch of the prison yard into a small but thriving vegetable garden. A patch of vibrant green in the middle of the gravel and concrete, it became a symbol of the entire project, new life growing in the most unlikely of places. Frank was the calm center of the storm. He moved through the chaos with an unerring sense of purpose, solving problems, offering guidance, and lending his skilled hands wherever they were needed most. He was a master carpenter, and this building was his masterpiece. Dorothy was his second in command, her ledger and spreadsheets the Bible of the operation. She tracked every donation, every volunteer hour, every purchase from Earl's Hardware, ensuring that nothing was wasted. The 30th day arrived. It was a cool, clear autumn morning. The work was done. The last paintbrush had been cleaned, the last wire connected. The jail was transformed. The exterior was still old, the brick still weathered, but it was clean. The windows were new, the roof was sound. Inside, the change was breathtaking. The grim corridors were now painted a warm, welcoming yellow. The cells were no longer cells. Each one had been converted into a small, neat, functional studio apartment. Each had a proper bed, a small kitchenette with a working sink and a hot plate, and a small but fully functional bathroom. The main hall was now a common area with comfortable second-hand furniture and a long dining table built by Frank. The place was clean, bright, and warm. It smelled of fresh paint and sawdust, not decay. At precisely 10 o'clock, Henderson's white sedan pulled up. He got out, his face as sour and impassive as ever, his clipboard in hand. He clearly expected to find the same ruin he had left 30 days ago, ready to sign the final demolition order and be done with it. Frank and Dorothy met him at the door. They didn't speak. They simply stepped aside and let him enter. Henderson stopped dead in the entrance hall. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He looked at the clean floors, the painted walls, the warm lights. He looked at the group of residents and volunteers who had gathered, a silent, hopeful crowd. He grunted, a sound of surprise he quickly stifled, and began his inspection. For the next 3 hours he was a silent, methodical force of scrutiny. He went through the building from top to bottom. He tested outlets, he flushed toilets, he checked the water pressure, he ran his hand over the new wiring in the basement. He climbed a ladder to inspect the roof repairs. He measured the width of the hallways. He checked the smoke detectors that had been installed in every room. He made notes on his clipboard, his expression giving nothing away. Frank, Dorothy, and their entire found family followed him at a respectful distance, their collective breath held. Every tick of his pen on the clipboard sounded like a gunshot. Finally, he was done. He returned to the main hall, the center of the building, and stood before Frank and Dorothy. The entire community gathered around them, a silent, protective circle. Henderson clicked his pen and looked down at his clipboard, reviewing his notes for a long, agonizing minute. Then he looked up. He looked at Frank. He looked at Dorothy. He looked around at the faces watching him. Lily holding her newborn baby, who had been born just a week prior. Alex, standing tall and confident. Arthur, his hands still stained with dirt from his garden. He saw not a collection of vagrants, but a community, a family. He looked at the building itself, at the quality of the workmanship, at the care that had been put into every detail. He tore the top sheet off his clipboard. It was the original condemnation notice. He tore it in half, then in half again, and dropped the pieces into a nearby trash can. He took a deep breath. "This isn't a jail anymore," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a note of something that sounded like awe. "This is a multi-family residence, and as of this moment, It's fully compliant with county code." He looked at Dorothy. "You passed." For a second there was a stunned silence. Then a cheer erupted. It was a raw, joyful, disbelieving sound that filled the hall and echoed off the high ceilings. People were hugging, crying, laughing. Dorothy felt tears streaming down her face. Frank put his arm around her, his own eyes wet. He had done it. They had done it. They had faced the system, the impossible deadline, the crushing weight of the bureaucracy, and they had won. Not by fighting it, but by building something better. Henderson, his job done, gave a single curt nod and walked out. He didn't look back, but as he got in his car, Frank could have sworn he saw the slightest hint of a smile on his face. The story did not end there. A young reporter for the regional newspaper, who had been tipped off by the pastor, had been waiting outside. He had witnessed Henderson's departure and the jubilant celebration that followed. He interviewed Frank and Dorothy, Lily, Earl Hobbs, and several of the volunteers. His article, published on the front page the following Sunday, was titled, "Hope House, Elderly Couple Turns Condemned Jail into Community Haven." The story was picked up by the Associated Press. It went viral. Suddenly, the small town of Redemption and its strange, wonderful jailhouse were famous. The attention brought a flood of donations, not just from the surrounding area, but from all over the country. Money, supplies, offers of professional help poured in. But the attention also brought scrutiny. The story of how Frank and Dorothy had ended up in Redemption, of their abandonment by their children, was a central part of the narrative. The contrast between their children's actions and the community's compassion was stark. An ambitious young assistant district attorney in their old home county read the story. She was moved by their plight and angered by the injustice. She contacted Dorothy. Dorothy, the meticulous bookkeeper, had saved everything. The emails from her children about Golden Valley, the bank statements showing the withdrawal of the house sale proceeds, the single receipt from the Starlight Inn. It was a perfect damning paper trail. The ADA launched a formal investigation into Mark and Sarah for financial fraud and felony elder abuse. The legal system, which had once dismissed them as a civil matter, now moved with surprising speed. Faced with the overwhelming evidence Dorothy had preserved, Sarah confessed immediately. Her shame and remorse were genuine. She had been swept up in her brother's scheme, too weak to resist, and had regretted it every day since. She agreed to cooperate fully with the prosecution and to pay back every cent of her share of the stolen money. Mark remained defiant. He hired an expensive lawyer and tried to paint his parents as senile and incompetent. But the story of the Hope House, the testimony of the dozens of people they had helped, and Dorothy's flawless records made him look like a fool and a liar. He was convicted by a jury in less than an hour. The consequences were severe. Justice, slow and indifferent at first, had finally been served. But for Frank and Dorothy, it was a hollow victory. They took no joy in their son's downfall. Their real victory was the building behind them and the family within it. With the influx of donations and the official blessing of the county, the Hope House was able to incorporate as a legitimate nonprofit organization. The name became official. Dorothy, with her bookkeeping skills, was the natural choice for treasurer. Frank was the head of maintenance and construction. They were no longer just residents, they were founders. They bought the empty lot next door, and with the help of a team of volunteer architects and builders, they began construction on a new wing, a purpose-built dormitory that would allow them to help even more people. The garden Arthur had started in the prison yard expanded, taking over the entire space. It became a huge, productive community garden, providing fresh vegetables for the residents and for the local food bank. It was a lush, green symbol of their philosophy. In the place of punishment, they had cultivated life. Lily became the house's first official employee, the resident manager. Her daughter, Hope, born in the darkest hour before the inspection, was the beloved child of the entire community, doted on by a dozen surrogate grandparents. Alex went to community college, studying computer science, and managed the Hope House's website and donation portal. The other residents, given the stability and support of a secure home, began to rebuild their own lives. They found jobs, went back to school, and reconnected with estranged families. Some moved on, making room for new people in need. Others chose to stay, becoming a permanent part of the strange and wonderful family that had grown inside the jailhouse walls. The project had become a point of pride for the town of Redemption, a beacon that drew in not just the needy, but also the good-hearted. One sunny afternoon, a year after the inspection, another car pulled up. This one was older, more modest. A woman got out. It was Sarah. She looked worn, older than her years. The legal battle had taken its toll. She approached the front door of the Hope House hesitantly, as if expecting to be turned away. Dorothy was on the front steps, weeding a flower box Frank had built. She looked up and saw her daughter. Sarah didn't make excuses. She didn't try to justify her actions. Her eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Mom," she whispered. The words were simple, unadorned, and heavy, with the weight of a year of regret. She held out a cashier's check. It was her first restitution payment, a significant sum. "It's not enough," she said. "It will never be enough, but it's a start." Dorothy looked at the check in her daughter's trembling hand. She looked at her daughter's ravaged face. She thought of the cold motel room, the unanswered phone calls, the crushing weight of betrayal. The pain was still there, a scar on her heart, but it was no longer a fresh wound. She looked over her shoulder at the open door of the Hope House. She could hear laughter from the common room. She could smell bread baking in the kitchen. She looked back at Sarah. She didn't take the check. She just looked at her daughter, this woman who had broken her heart, and she saw a flicker of the little girl she had raised. Frank came out, wiping his hands on a rag. He saw Sarah and stopped, his face unreadable. He looked at Dorothy, a silent question in his eyes. Dorothy gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She turned back to Sarah. "The door's open," she said. It was all she needed to say. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet, but it was an invitation. It was a beginning. Sarah started visiting every weekend. She didn't talk much. She just worked. She helped Arthur in the garden. She helped Lily with the baby. She washed dishes. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to rebuild the bridge she had burned, one small, humble act of service at a time. Mark never came. He never called. He never wrote. His silence was its own kind of verdict. Another year passed. The Hope House thrived. The new wing was complete, its rooms full. The garden was a riot of color and life. It was a warm summer evening. Frank and Dorothy sat together on a simple wooden bench that Frank had built and placed under the shade of a newly planted maple tree. From here, they could see the whole of their small kingdom. They could see the lights coming on in the windows of the old jail, the building that had once been their prison and was now their palace. They could see residents sitting at the long tables in the yard, sharing a meal. The sound of their laughter and conversation drifted on the warm air. Dorothy held Frank's hand. His skin was still rough from his work, but his hand was steady and strong in hers. In her other hand, she held a small, faded photograph. It was a picture of the two of them, taken 52 years ago. They were young, smiling, standing in front of the first house they had built, the house that was now just a memory. She looked from the young, hopeful faces in the photograph to the building before her. Frank had built that first house for a family of 4. He had built it with love and hope for a future that had not unfolded as planned. Then she looked at the Hope House, a sprawling, eclectic, beautiful place built from a ruin. Frank had built this place, too. Not for the family they had lost, but for the family they had found. He had built it out of despair and determination, and it had become a home for dozens. Frank followed her gaze. He understood her thought without her having to speak. It was the easy, silent communication of a lifetime together. He put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. As the dusk deepened, the single powerful porch light he had installed above the main entrance flickered on. It was a permanent beacon, a promise of safety and welcome, shining brightly against the coming night.